Hi everybody. In our last video when we looked at Microsoft Forms and Power Automate, we looked at how we could take a personal form from Microsoft Forms, upload a video and then move the file automatically from OneDrive into SharePoint. We're going to turn that on its head slightly this time, and we're going to look at this time a group enabled form and how we can associate it with a SharePoint site to start off with, but still then work with it in the same way. When we first create our forms, they are personal. That means that they are associated to me as a user. That means that if I upload a file into the form, it will be put into my personal OneDrive. But that really doesn't give me the redundancy over the form. So especially if it's something that becomes quite critical to the business, I don't really want it associated with me, because as a user, if I leave, that form is going to eventually be deleted. So the first thing that we can do is we can start to make that a group enabled form. So we'll look through how we can do that. And we'll then take the flow that we created in the first video, where we move the files from OneDrive into SharePoint. We'll look at the modifications that we then need to make to that flow in order to make it work with our new group enabled form. So just as a reminder, let's have a quick look at what we used before. So in the first video, we created this form, which was the file submission, and I've just labelled it personal there. All it did was ask for some basic text and ask for some files to be uploaded. And as we saw in the first video, the files got uploaded into the default document library in the OneDrive. And we created the flow to go through and get the response, to parse the output that came back from that response, and then automatically move it from OneDrive to SharePoint using the move file action within the SharePoint connector. But like I've said, we want to try and now reduce the redundancy, reduce the reliance on this being a personal form. We actually want to be able to share it. But just before we do this, I'm just going to remind you that if I was to come and create a new flow and create it when a new response is submitted, I can click on the drop down and I can see that my form is listed there. So that's just the first thing I'm going to point out, just one of the little changes that we're going to see. And if I just do a repeat code to see what I'm actually working with here, then when I actually look at the code, I can see that I've got a form ID here. And that's the form ID that we are looking for whenever we use when a new response is submitted, or when we actually get the response. Where does that come from? That actually comes from, in my form, if I look in my URL, I have that same form ID currently located in the URL. So that matches NY4U, NY4U. Currently they both match, they exist. So let's go through the process now of making this a group enabled form, because I want to be able to easily share this with my colleagues. I want them to be able to update it. I don't just want this to be tied to me and have to rely on a collaboration link in order to be able to share it. So let's go and click on the three dots. And I still don't quite agree with the terminology here, but I need to move the form. And effectively what I'm doing is moving the form from my personal space into a group enabled space. So if I click on move, what this is going to do is ask me to choose a destination. And here I've got 3 Microsoft 365 groups. So I'm going to select my FlowBites group and I'm going to select move. So now that's happened, if I just refresh my screen, then I now have down here in my groups, I have a total of 1 form. And if I go into there, I can see that my form is there. But let's just come back into Flow to start off with. Let's just do a quick refresh on this and let's go and re-add that action back in. So I've got my trigger. So I've got my trigger when a new response is submitted. But this time, when I select the drop down to come and select my new form, it's not there. So when I'm using the trigger and the corresponding action, for Microsoft Forms to get the response, the forms that it presents to me in the drop-downs only correspond to those that are personal. So if I'm doing working with group-enabled forms, then I need to do a little bit more work in the first place in order to get them working. It's not a huge amount, but it's this little gotcha that has sometimes caught people out. So if I come back to my list of flows, here's my FlowBites personal form. Now, for all intents and purposes, this should work because I created my personal form, I connected my flow to it. So let's just go and do a test. But obviously the change that I've made is that I've made it now from being a personal into a group-enabled form. Let's go and submit another entry. So I'm going to come to my form. Let's go and do a preview. I think this is about the third test that I've put through this, and let's upload a file. And let's submit. Okay, so Forms is happy. Forms doesn't care that it's now a group-enabled form. Forms is just a form. But if I actually come across into my Cloudflow, I'm now getting an error. So it's trying to get an output from the response. I've still got my ID in there. If I click to download the actual JSON, let's just zoom in on that a little bit. I don't really get anything back from that. I've got a response ID. Maybe that's good. Maybe that's working. But I actually get an error from the get response details because it's now saying that it can't find the table that's storing the data. And that's because it's now moved away from being my personal area into the group area. So something's changed here. Let's just dive into this a little bit more. So let's come back into here. Oh, so now that I've come here, my form ID isn't resolving anymore to the form name like it did when it was a personal one. So let's just take a look at this. So let's take that ID and let's go and open up trusty Notepad. So that was my original ID. If I now come to my file, to my form in Forms, now that I've made it a group form, first of all, I've now got a root which identifies it as being a group form. And let's go and grab the ID. So the ID is actually now changed. Not by much, but there are a number of consistencies in there, but there are differences that mean that my lookup to go and find that original ID no longer work. So I now need to go and do some make some additional changes to my original flow to now make this work again. So what do I need to do? Well, the first thing that I need to do is take this ID. This is the ID that came from my group-enabled form. If I get rid of that for a moment, I still see no items. So even though I know that the form's there, I'm using the form, Flow still doesn't know about it. So I need to explicitly tell it the ID of the form that I want it to go and find. And to do that, I need to enter a custom value. And I'm going to paste my new ID into that form ID. But before I can run this again, I still need to go and get my response details, and I also need to do exactly the same here. I need to update the form ID. Let's go and paste that in. Has anything else changed from my flow so far? No, it hasn't. So I can still use the response ID. My actions are still named the same, so I don't need to worry too much about those. The outputs are exactly the same, so I've still got the question, which is the provided evidence. So let's just go and run this. I'm expecting it to fail again in a moment. But everything else within the form is still the same. So I'm still using the same inputs for my files uploaded, for my parsing my JSON. It's still giving me exactly the same information. I appreciate that you all read that really quickly, but we'll worry about that in a moment. But I've now got a failure further down. And what it's saying is that in my error that it's failed to verify the existence of the source object. So something else has changed in the move from making my form a personal form into a group-enabled form. And the key difference now is that the files aren't uploaded into OneDrive anymore. Now, because it's a group-enabled form, a Microsoft 365 group has that SharePoint site available to it. So it's going to store the documents within SharePoint. Let's go and find it. So if I come to my default document library in my SharePoint site, this is the same place where my channel folders go from Microsoft Teams, but I've got apps, I've got Microsoft Forms, I've got my file submission, and there's my file. So the actual folder structure is exactly the same as what it was when it was in OneDrive. The only difference now is where it's storing it. So rather than being in OneDrive, it's put it straight into SharePoint. Now, again, I've got a number of different ways that I can now handle this. I can do exactly the same as what I did with my personal flow, which is I moved it from its originating area, and then I moved it into a different document library. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to update our flow to now go and look at SharePoint instead of looking at OneDrive. So there's my file. Let's go back to my run history and let's go and edit. So I'm happy that everything so far still works. So all of the work that I tried to do previously from a personal form, I'm still happy. That still works. Effectively, I've gone almost through like a publishing process where I've done it personal to start off with, proved the process, and then I'm making some updates once I've published it into live. I would personally do it straight into SharePoint, but everybody has their own way of doing things. So, first thing, my compose here. This is my OneDrive Forms folder. It's no longer OneDrive. So whereas I got my Documents, Apps, Microsoft Forms, File Submission, Personal Question, that's no longer the case. Let's go do exactly the same as what I did in the first video, which was go and find the address. So the first thing that I need to change is my current site. So I'm going to change it back to my FlowBites site because that's where my files have been uploaded to, because that was the group that I associated the form with. Let's go and find the file. So let's go in my show picker. Let's go to my shared documents, which is the underlying URL for the default document library. In there, I've got my apps, I've got my forms, I've got my file submission. But the nice thing is, actually, when I've moved it, it's renamed the folders for me as well. So it's no longer called question, like it was in personal. It's now actually called something really useful. It's called provide evidence. So it matches the question terminology. So let's go and grab that thumbnail. And exactly like what I did before, I extracted the key part of the URL. So I want all of that. Oh, not the T. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste that into my compose above. I'm going to then remove all of that and I'm going to put back in my compose from the file path, which is this action above, which takes the outputs from my OneDrive Forms folder and adds on the file name to it. So exactly the same process as what we did before, but now we're just updating it to be able to look at SharePoint instead. So just to avoid confusion, I am going to go and just rename that to my Compose SP Forms folder. Good, that's automatically updated. So now, if I go and save, and let's run one more test through, and let's go and submit one last response. Test 4, upload the file, and let's go and find a better picture. Okay, so this time I've uploaded a file. Let's go and submit. So if I come back to SharePoint, my awards win Matt Weston picture appears in my provide evidence folder. It's disappeared. And now if I come to my forms docs, which is my other document library, just like we did in the first video, my file now appears in my forms docs. So a lot of what we covered in the first video with moving the file from OneDrive into SharePoint applies here. I don't treat the technologies any differently. They are exactly the same. But what I've tried to point out are really just some of those little differences just to be aware of. Number one, when you make a form group enabled, it changes the ID. It no longer appears in the drop-down selector for any of the forms actions or the trigger. So that means that I need to go and input the ID manually. And that ID I can grab out of the URL of the form when it's in preview mode. But then what else did I do? I then went and changed my where I was actually picking the file up from, because when the form becomes group enabled, the file gets stored in SharePoint rather than being in OneDrive. So immediately it's in an area that is then there for collaboration. It's there for me to then go and do something else with much more easily than when it was in OneDrive. But all I did was exactly the same as what I did before. I used the move file action from SharePoint to move it just from one document library to another. It could have been from one site to another site. The possibilities now are endless. So keep those little pieces in mind when you do go and create your group enabled forms. They are little gotchas that tend to catch people out. But if you do have any questions, please do feel free to reach out. You can reach me on Twitter at MattWeston365. You can find me on LinkedIn, just search for Matt Weston. Or you can post in the comments for this video and I'll be happy to give you any help that you would like. But for now, that's our 2 forms videos, and I hope they've been useful. But I hope you all stay safe, look after yourselves, and we'll speak again soon.